Behind the flashing cameras, glittering red carpets, and thunderous applause lies a side of fame the world rarely witnesses. The final chapters written not in celebration, but in sorrow. Some of the most iconic black celebrities in history didn't just pass away. They departed beneath clouds of controversy, heartbreak, unanswered questions, and funerals so devastating they left millions shaken to their core. These weren't quiet goodbyes. From painful family disputes and public tensions to sudden losses that stunned entire communities, their memorials became moments of collective grief. Streets overflowed with mourners. Tears streamed down faces across the nation. Long-buried secrets surfaced. And in many cases, the anguish surrounding their passing felt just as powerful and unforgettable as the legacy they built. Behind every casket was a story. Behind every tribute, a deeper truth. Behind every farewell, a wave of emotion that rippled far beyond the spotlight. Tonight, we're stepping beyond the headlines to uncover the most heartbreaking and tragic funerals of black celebrities, stories that reveal the weight carried not only by grieving families, but by fans and an entire culture. Some of these will shatter your heart. Others may forever change the way you remember their final goodbye. Dinah Washington. Dinah Washington. Empty pill bottles. Whispered arguments. And 7 ex-husbands standing too close to the casket. In the smoky, perfume-soaked winter air of Chicago, 1963, the Queen of the Blues was laid out like a tragic masterpiece, beautiful, expensive, and painfully ironic. The woman whose voice once cut through silence like a blade now lay still, her power reduced to memory. Around her coffin stood the men who had once claimed to love her, their faces arranged in rehearsed shock while their thoughts circled something far less sacred: royalties, property, percentages. She was only 39. One reckless night. Too much liquor. Too many pills, sleeping aids and diet tablets swallowed to quiet the pressure, to control the image, to outrun a loneliness no spotlight could erase. By morning, the voice that had shaken stages across America was gone. But the most haunting detail wasn't the ornate casket or the diamond-bright floral arrangements. It was the emptiness. The VIP pews, reserved for industry giants, power players, fair-weather friends, sat half vacant. The titans of entertainment made brief, polished appearances, offering condolences like business cards before slipping away to brighter rooms and louder parties. In the shadows, where candlelight barely reached, the real grief lived. Calloused hands, worn jackets, working-class fans and struggling musicians who wept without calculation. They didn't see a fortune in that coffin. They saw a woman who bled her pain into every note, who turned heartbreak into hymns. To them, she wasn't an asset, she was salvation. Behind the glamour of the funeral lingered a colder truth. A diva labeled difficult, a woman battling demons no applause could drown out. The luxury surrounding her farewell felt like heavy stage makeup, thick enough to hide the reality that she died from a wound no prescription could numb. The empty vials beside her bed read like the final bars of a tragic blues arrangement, proof of a life propped up by chemicals to sustain confidence and composure. And while her ex-husbands quietly disputed the division of her estate, her true inheritance, her voice, rose higher than any argument. It lived in the tears of the poor, in the trembling silence after a record stopped spinning. Fame revealed its cruelty that day. Backstage, bottles were uncorked. Gossip flowed more freely than prayer. Scandals were dissected. The farewell blurred into spectacle. Dinah Washington lay there eerily serene, crowned in death as she had been in life, queen. But the air was thick with greed and indifference, a bitter reminder that in the glittering world of stardom, loyalty often expires before the spotlight does. When the final note fades, when the pills are gone, when the applause turns to echoes, all that remains are the vultures, and the music of a legend who paid too high a price to sing the blues. Otis Redding. Otis Redding. A frozen lake basin. Vapors rising off the dark, silent depths of Lake Monona. Inside a Georgia funeral home in the suffocating heat of the American South in 1967, something sat beside the coffin that left thousands of mourners stunned into silence. A simple glass jar filled with water from Lake Monona. The water had frozen into a cloudy block of ice, murky and cold, like a piece of the tragedy itself preserved for eternity. And there he lay, Otis Redding, the king of soul. The man whose blazing voice had ignited stages and warmed millions of hearts. Now motionless. Pulled from the icy depths after a catastrophic plane crash that ended everything in an instant. The scene was unbearable. The thick perfume of lilies couldn't cover the bitter chill radiating from that frozen jar. It stood there like a cruel symbol, proof that fate had used ice to extinguish the brightest flame in black music at the very height of its brilliance. He was only 26. His death tore a deep wound into American music history, exposing the fragile reality black artists faced in an era of segregation, forced to travel on aging planes, racing between hostile states just to be heard. Only days before the crash, he had finished recording Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, a song about waiting, about longing, about watching life drift by. The haunting irony? He would never sit on any dock again. The crash on Lake Monona didn't just claim a life, it stole a future. A future where soul music might have reshaped the world under his command. It left behind a silence no voice could ever fully replace. A void that still echoes. That block of cloudy ice on the altar became a silent witness. It held the unspoken story of his final moments, alone in the freezing dark, surrounded by twisted metal and shattered dreams. The man whose breath once burned with passion and power met his end in the grip of bitter cold. There was a brutal irony in that jar. The voice that radiated heat, that poured fire into every note, was silenced by ice. From that moment forward, his legacy was frozen in youth, eternally 26, eternally rising. The funeral became more than a goodbye. It was a chilling reminder of how quickly greatness can vanish. As mourners lined up, some trembling as they touched the cold glass urn, the sharp divide of fame was impossible to ignore. In one corner, record executives quietly calculated the projected surge in posthumous album sales. In another, grieving fans, many with little to their names, just wanted one last moment close to the man who had given them everything through song. Otis Redding was gone. The fiery breath of soul sank beneath the waters of Lake Monona, leaving behind a funeral steeped in sorrow and a hard lesson about how swiftly destiny can swallow brilliance whole. And that frozen jar remained, cold and merciless, a reminder that even the hottest flame can be drowned in silence. Nat King Cole. In 1965, inside a lavish Los Angeles funeral parlor draped in orchids and heavy with perfume, the world gathered to say goodbye to Nat King Cole. Candlelight flickered against polished wood. The air tried to feel sacred, dignified, worthy of the most elegant voice of the century. But beside the casket sat something jarringly ordinary. A silver ashtray. It was filled with gray ashes and half-smoked cigarette butts, small, ugly remnants that told a far more honest story than the flowers ever could. There he lay, the man whose velvet baritone once softened racial tension on American television, whose voice felt like midnight silk. Now his body was thin, fragile, ravaged by lung cancer. He was only 45. At the height of his fame, at the peak of his power, and the ashtray sat there like a silent witness, a cold, metallic confession. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. The very habit he believed protected his signature sound had become the weapon that destroyed him. Convinced that smoke deepened and preserved his rich, husky tone, he reportedly smoked up to 3 packs a day. Not for pleasure, not for rebellion, but for perfection. For control. For survival in a world that demanded flawlessness from a black man who dared to stand center stage. Behind the effortless charm, behind the tailored suits and gentle smile, lived relentless pressure. To be impeccable. To be unthreatening. To be extraordinary, always. The smoke became ritual. The ritual became dependence. And the dependence became a quiet contract with death. While millions melted into the sweetness of unforgettable, he inhaled destruction one cigarette at a time. The ashtray beside his coffin no longer looked decorative. It looked symbolic, ashes of tobacco mixing with the ashes of a life lived under impossible expectations. Hollywood stars and political figures filled the pews that day. Cameras flashed. Tributes flowed. Yet that small silver tray seemed to accuse the room of something unspoken. The price of acceptance. The cost of being iconic. The burden of carrying grace in a divided America. The press celebrated him as a bridge between worlds. But his loved ones saw the truth in those crushed cigarette ends, proof of a man who slowly burned himself away to keep the music flawless. When Nat King Cole was laid to rest, he left behind more than timeless jazz standards. He left a haunting lesson. Talent can light up the world, but the world can consume that light just as quickly. Like a cigarette glowing brightly before fading into ash in a silver tray. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday. 70 cents on her shroud. Iron handcuffs at her grave. Inside a cramped New York funeral parlor in 1959, the heavy scent of white gardenias, her signature bloom, hung thick in the air, sweet but powerless against the colder smell of death and injustice. Lady Day lay still, the woman whose voice carried the sorrow of the Mississippi River, a jazz legend who sang the bruised truth of the human condition. She had given the world her pain in melody, and now her journey ended in a silence that felt less like peace and more like protest. Resting on the white cloth that covered her body was 70 cents, the full remainder of her fortune. 70 cents. A humiliating number that exposed the cruel arithmetic of fame. A woman who filled concert halls, who moved nations with a single note, reduced to spare change. It wasn't just poverty. It was a verdict. Outside, federal agents lingered like shadows that refused to lift. Even in death, they hovered. In life, they had shackled her to a hospital bed while her liver failed and her breath grew thin. She was guarded like a violent criminal as her body surrendered. And when she finally slipped away, the marks of iron still bruised her wrists, mute testimony to a system that chose punishment over mercy. Her crime? Addiction, yes, but also defiance. Through Strange Fruit, she dared to force America to look at the horror of lynched black bodies hanging from trees. She turned a microphone into an indictment. And for that, she was hunted. They didn't just want to silence an addict. They wanted to break a voice that exposed the nation's ugliest truths. The 70 cents beside her body felt like a final insult, a slap across the face of a music industry that profited from her anguish, applauded her genius, and abandoned her when the lights dimmed. Lady Day's tragedy wasn't an accident. It was the slow erosion of a soul battered by abuse, racism, addiction, and relentless surveillance. A life pushed to the edge by a system uncomfortable with a black woman who refused to sing quietly. There is a brutal irony in that funeral room. The woman who restored dignity to her people with every trembling note was denied dignity in her final days. She died a prisoner, chained not just by metal, but by discrimination. The gardenias around her began to wilt under candlelight, their petals folding inward like the closing bars of a sorrowful song. Her brilliance, once dazzling, could not buy her freedom in her final hours. And the agent standing outside proved one last bitter truth. For Billie Holiday, even death was not an escape, only the last note in a long, broken blues. She left this world with a hoarse, wounded voice and empty pockets, but her music remains untouchable. The 70 cents on her shroud may have marked the poverty of her bank account, but it could never measure the wealth of her legacy. Donny Hathaway. Donny Hathaway. The headphones in the coffin. The echoes from the 15th floor. At his funeral in St. Louis, grief hung thick in the air, but nothing stunned the room quite like the sight beside him. A pair of large studio headphones resting near the casket of a man whose voice once felt like velvet wrapped around heartbreak. Donny Hathaway, a singular genius blessed with heavenly tone and burdened with a mind at war with itself. He looked almost peaceful that day. A haunting contrast to the way he was found. On a cold January night in 1979, his body discovered on the sidewalk beneath the 15th floor of the Essex House Hotel in New York. 33 years old. A voice that shaped soul music forever, suddenly silenced. Those headphones were not just a symbolic tribute. They were witnesses. In his final years, Donny had begun recording strange sounds, fragments of static, whispers no one else could hear, murmurs that blurred the line between music and madness. As schizophrenia tightened its grip, the studio became both sanctuary and battlefield. What once carried melody now carried electricity. Invisible voices. Paranoia. He believed forces were trying to steal his gift through radio waves, through currents humming in the walls. The very medium that made him immortal became the maze that trapped him. This was not the fall of a forgotten star. At the time, he was still creating, still collaborating with brilliance, most notably with Roberta Flack. Fame had not abandoned him. Applause had not faded. But inside, something far more fragile had collapsed. His nervous system, worn thin by fear and pressure, could no longer carry the weight of his sensitivity in a world that rarely protects its geniuses. The fall from the 15th floor was more than a headline, more than accident or suicide. It felt like the final desperate act of a tormented soul trying to escape the electrical storm inside his own mind. A tragic attempt to unplug from the currents that never stopped buzzing. And so the headphones lay there in the coffin, a chilling symbol. While the world mourned a golden voice, Donnie may have only wanted one thing: silence. Real silence. The kind he believed he couldn't find in life. Around him stood friends and fellow artists, eyes heavy with shock. They understood that this wasn't a lack of talent or love. It was a battle lost in private. No contract, no award, no standing ovation could quiet the noise he heard. There was no music at that moment. Only stillness. A suffocating, sacred stillness. Donny Hathaway was laid to rest, his headphones beside him, as if he might still be listening, somewhere deeper than we can reach. And the question lingered over the skyline of that New York hotel. Did he finally find the silence he longed for? Or is he still out there, tuning into the eternal hum of something only he could hear? Dorothy Dandridge. Dorothy Dandridge. The baby's cry wasn't loud. And the $2 receipt lay there like a cruel whisper in the suffocating silence of a West Hollywood funeral home in 1965. Row after row of empty seats exposed the cold indifference of an industry that once fed on her light. In the stillness, Dorothy Dandridge rested without applause, without cameras, without the glitter that once crowned her. She had been Carmen Jones, the first black woman to break through the Academy's walls and earn an Oscar nomination for Best Actress. A woman who dazzled the world with elegance and fire. Yet her 42-year journey did not end in standing ovations. It ended with the faint scent of cheap, wilting white carnations. But the most heartbreaking sight in that room wasn't the casket. It was Hari Lin. In her early 20s, yet forever trapped with the mind of a 4-year-old, Hari Lin stood confused and frightened. Her wide, innocent eyes searched her mother's face, but saw only a distant, glittering stranger. She cried, overwhelmed by unfamiliar walls and hushed voices, never understanding that the woman lying before her had given everything, her blood, her beauty, her last dollar, just to secure her daughter a place in a public psychiatric institution. Beneath the white silk lining of the coffin lay the harshest truth of all. A bank receipt for $2.14. That was what remained of a woman who once commanded million-dollar contracts. A fragile slip of paper, proof of financial ruin after betrayal, bad deals, and Hollywood's abandonment. It was a humiliating final statement. A system had consumed her talent, profited from her beauty, then discarded her when she could no longer generate income. Dorothy died alone in a rented apartment. She carried with her the private grief of a life stripped of dignity, of motherhood overshadowed by struggle, of hope eroded by debt and discrimination. Hari Lin's cries echoed through the nearly empty room, the only true elegy for a genius lost to neglect. On one side of that casket lay the memory of a woman who once mesmerized the world. On the other stood the living consequence of pain, poverty, and prejudice. Dorothy left this world after an overdose of antidepressants, a black diamond crushed between the grinding gears of fame and racial injustice. The $2 receipt resting beside her felt like bitter irony. In that glittering world, you can rise to the top, but the same machine can drag you back to nothing, leaving your hands empty and your heart shattered. Where were the directors who once praised her brilliance? The co-stars who shared the spotlight? The lovers who swore devotion? Gone. All gone. Absent from her final journey. Her greatest tragedy wasn't simply her death. It was that the only farewell came from a daughter who would never fully understand who her mother was. The cries of a child who could not even name the legend she was losing. Dorothy Dandridge departed this world, leaving behind a question that still lingers. How did we allow one of our brightest stars to fade into silence? How did an icon who broke barriers end with nothing but $2.14 and the trembling sobs of a child who couldn't comprehend goodbye? Sometimes the cruelest part of fame isn't the fall. It's the silence that follows. Baby Huey. Baby Huey. In 1970, inside a small church on Chicago's South Side, the silence wasn't broken by the fiery pulse of soul music, it was torn apart by the shriek of wood-scraping stone. 10 men strained, grunting under the crushing weight of a coffin too large for the narrow doorway. The casket jammed halfway through, wedged tight. Wood groaned. Shoulders buckled. Breath grew ragged. Even in death, Baby Huey was too big for the room. Born James Ramey, Baby Huey was the towering force whose thunderous voice and explosive stage presence helped lay the groundwork for funk. On stage, he moved like a storm, wild, magnetic, unstoppable. Offstage, he carried a body that weighed over 400 pounds, a burden that followed him everywhere. Now, that same weight filled a custom-built coffin, measuring out the final chapter of a life that burned fast and heavy. When the casket struck the stone wall, the crack echoed like a cruel metaphor. For 26 years, his body had been both instrument and prison. The struggle at the church door felt symbolic, one last resistance, as if the world still didn't quite have space for him. Behind the larger-than-life performer was a young man wrestling with loneliness, insecurity, and the ache of never feeling comfortable in his own skin. Music was his escape hatch. On stage, he was limitless. But off stage, the weight, physical and emotional, never loosened its grip. Heroin became another attempt at flight, a desperate reach for lightness, for relief from a body and mind that felt unbearably heavy. In the end, his heart gave out, acute heart failure, brought on by extreme weight gain and drug abuse. The giant who made speakers tremble was silenced by an overloaded heart. There's something haunting about the contrast. His recordings burst with freedom, raw, electric, alive. Yet his final moments were confined to a few cramped square feet of polished wood, stuck between a doorframe and the outside world. The creaking wasn't just timber under pressure. It sounded like a soul that had spent a lifetime trying to break free. No glamorous roses. No triumphant encore. Just 10 exhausted men, faces flushed, shirts damp with sweat, bearing the weight of a talent that the world never fully knew how to hold. Baby Huey left at just 26 years old, taking with him a voice that could shake ceilings, and a lifetime of pain carried in silence. His funeral became more than a goodbye. It became a stark reminder of how much weight a person can carry inside, when the music is loud, but the hurt is louder. James Carr, the man with the red charm bags, and a 30-year escape from darkness that never truly set him free. Inside a candlelit funeral parlor in Memphis in 2001, James Carr lay still, the voice once crowned the singer, the man whose haunting classic The Dark End of the Street could make even stone hearts break. But beneath the silk draped over a legend, there were no shining trophies, no symbols of glory. Hidden quietly under the fabric were small red mojo bags, southern spiritual charms he clung to in desperation, hoping they might silence the voices that medicine never could. The image was raw, painfully honest, because even at the height of his fame, James Carr never truly lived in the light. For 3 long decades, he was a prisoner, shuffled in and out of psychiatric hospitals, battling devastating schizophrenia, enduring electroshock treatments and heavy tranquilizers in Memphis. His death at 58 wasn't sudden. It was the final note of a sorrowful song that had been playing since that chilling night in Japan in 1979, when he froze on stage before thousands, standing motionless like a statue while the crowd waited for a voice that could no longer break through his silence. For 30 years after his peak, the world replayed his music while he fought an invisible war. The red amulets sewn beneath his shroud weren't superstition, they were proof of absolute loneliness. A black artist caught between traditional faith and modern psychiatry, between the glamour of a soul icon and the cold reality of a mental patient. The scars of treatment were written across his face, transforming an uncrowned king into a fragile survivor. Every note he had ever sung now felt like a cry for help, applauded, consumed, but unanswered. As fellow musicians bowed their heads that day, there was a strange sense of release. No more prescriptions. No more whispered voices in the night. James Carr was finally free. He went into the earth with those red charm bags, ending a journey through the abyss of his own mind. And that funeral left behind a haunting truth. Sometimes the voices that heal the world cannot save themselves from the darkness within. Florence Ballard. Florence Ballard. In a damp, dimly lit funeral parlor in Detroit in 1976, the air felt heavy with a cruel kind of irony. Florence Ballard, the thunderous voice, the raw soul who helped give birth to the Supremes, lay still in a modest, makeshift coffin, the kind meant for the forgotten. There were no extravagant wreaths from the Motown empire she helped build. No shimmering sequined gowns like the ones she wore when the spotlight adored her. Just silence and a pair of worn-out shoes. Those shoes broke hearts. Scuffed at the heels, tired at the soles, they told a story no headline ever did. In her final years, Florence had been living on welfare, walking the cracked sidewalks of Detroit, abandoned by the very machine she helped create. Cast out of the group she co-founded, stripped of royalties, pushed aside when she no longer fit the polished image Motown's powerful men demanded, her fall was not sudden. It was systematic. Officially, she died of a heart attack at 32. But to those who knew the truth, it felt like something slower, colder, a long erosion of dignity. From international star to struggling single mother of 3, living in a rundown apartment, fighting quietly for justice that never came. Those worn shoes weren't just leather and thread. They were miles of pain, miles of pride swallowed, miles of survival. At the funeral, cameras flashed. Former colleagues arrived. Tears were shed. Yet the cheap coffin stood as a silent accusation against an industry built on glamour and control. The candlelight flickered against her scuffed heels like a bitter reminder. Behind the sparkle of fame stood a woman drained of her talent, her money, and her place in history. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was the aftermath of betrayal. The world celebrated the Supremes. But it let one of its founding queens fade into poverty because she dared to question contracts, to speak up, to resist being reshaped. Florence Ballard was laid to rest not as the powerhouse she was, but as a warning. Her shoes rested beneath thin silk lining, quiet but unforgettable. A final testimony that in the music empire, angels are manufactured, and when their shine dulls, they're discarded just as quickly. Hollywood may crown you a diva. Motown may sell your voice to the world. But when your shoes are no longer polished for the red carpet, they're often the first to dig your grave. Professor Longhair. Professor Longhair. The snapped string. The unfinished blues. The silenced heartbeat of the King of New Orleans. In 1980, beneath the heavy, humid sky of New Orleans, something eerie happened as mourners gathered to say goodbye. Just as the service began, a sharp, brittle snap cracked through the room. A piano string, tight, trembling, suddenly broke in the corner, as if it had felt the moment its master crossed over. The sound cut through the church like fate itself, announcing the end of a rhythm that once made the city sway. Professor Longhair, fess to those who loved him, was the architect of New Orleans piano, the man who stitched rumba rhythms into the bloodstream of American music. And yet, in a cruel twist of timing, he took his final breath from a pulmonary embolism just hours before the release of his long-awaited comeback album, Crawfish Fiesta. After decades of obscurity, scraping by in smoky clubs and forgotten casinos, after years of poverty that nearly erased his name, recognition was finally returning. The world was just beginning to listen again. And then, silence. At the funeral, lilies perfumed the air, but regret hung heavier. Fresh vinyl copies of Crawfish Fiesta, still smelling of ink and promise, rested near a coffin already growing cold. Radio stations were spinning his joyful, rolling piano lines while the man who created them lay still, beyond applause, beyond justice. The irony was unbearable, celebration on the airwaves, suffocating grief in the pews. For the people of New Orleans, that broken string was no accident. It was a cry. A protest from a soul that had poured its last strength into the studio, only to collapse the moment the masterpiece was complete. The gaunt faces of brass band musicians, the loyal fans who had followed him for half a century, reflected a painful truth: honor often arrives too late. The world crowns its kings when they can no longer wear the crown. Professor Longhair went into the earth carrying rhythms no one else could ever replicate. The city was ready to celebrate his return, but instead, it buried him. And what lingered after the final prayer wasn't just grief, it was a lesson. Sometimes glory comes at the wrong hour. Sometimes the most haunting music a genius leaves behind is not a triumphant encore, but the abrupt, echoing silence after a single broken string. Alberta Hunter. Alberta Hunter. A crisp white nurse's blouse, and a 20-year secret buried beneath the ashes of fame. In a quiet New York funeral parlor in 1984, a scene unfolded that could break the heart of anyone who knew the history of the blues. The front row wasn't lined with Broadway royalty or music executives. Instead, it was filled with nurses and hospital staff in spotless uniforms, their faces stunned, their grief sincere and simple. They believed they were saying goodbye to a devoted colleague. Inside the casket lay Alberta Hunter, once the blazing diamond of Broadway, a voice that could shake chandeliers and silence a room with a single note. She had dazzled international stages, defined an era of blues, and lived nearly 9 decades. Yet even in death, the truth of who she really was stunned the very people who had worked beside her for years. For 2 decades, they knew her only as a dedicated nurse at Goldwater Hospital, steady, compassionate, unassuming. None of them suspected they were sharing shifts with a living legend. Her death exposed a brutal truth about the music industry. When a black woman aged out of its narrow expectations, she was discarded like outdated merchandise. In 1954, faced with shrinking opportunities and quiet erasure, Alberta made a choice that was both heartbreaking and defiant. She didn't beg. She didn't fade publicly. She disappeared. She shaved years off her age, enrolled in nursing school, and buried Alberta Hunter the star beneath a white medical uniform. The stage lights dimmed, replaced by fluorescent hospital corridors. Applause gave way to the hum of machines and whispered reassurances to patients in pain. At her funeral, the irony was almost unbearable. The white coat of a caregiver had become the final curtain for a diva. Her colleagues mourned a kind, retired nurse, unaware that the woman they loved had once embodied glamour, freedom, and artistic fire on the world's most dazzling stages. It was as if her silence had been intentional, a quiet rebellion against a world that had rejected her brilliance. To survive with dignity, she chose anonymity over humiliation. She protected her pride by burying her own legend. The nurses wept for a friend. Outside those walls, the world began loudly reclaiming her as a musical icon. Alberta Hunter left this earth carrying the secret of her vanishing act, one of the most astonishing disappearances in music history. Her white blouse remains a haunting symbol. Fame can be stripped away, applause can fade, but the dignity of an iron-willed woman can never be extinguished, even when she chooses to walk away unseen. Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker. The woman who once set Europe on fire with her fearless hips and her scandalous banana skirt now lay still, sealed inside a dark green French military uniform buttoned tight to her chin. The image was almost unbearable. The world's most untamed spirit dressed in rigid ceremony. A goddess of rhythm confined in iron discipline. This was more than a funeral. It felt like a contradiction carved in stone. Josephine had lived in motion, in laughter, in defiance, in bare skin and bold freedom. She was a woman who turned desire into art and prejudice into power. Yet in death, she was wrapped in medals and military cloth, as if the world needed to tame her one last time. The Legion of Honor pinned to her chest gleamed coldly, reflecting a nation that celebrated her bravery in wartime, but once allowed her to be pushed from her chateau, humiliated, nearly ruined while trying to protect her rainbow tribe, the 12 children she adopted to prove that love could outshine racism. At 68, her death was not a gentle fading of a legend. It was the collapse of a woman who had danced until her final breath. Just days earlier, she had been on stage again, spinning beneath bright lights, fighting to save her family from debt and disgrace. She never stopped performing. She never stopped proving that a black woman was more than a fantasy for the world's applause. As the mournful gunfire echoed through Paris streets, a bitter truth settled in. The world adored Josephine when she dazzled. It respected her only when she stood still. The uniform felt like a final mask, covering the body that had once terrified and thrilled society in equal measure. Only in silence, it seemed, was she granted full dignity. Rows of soldiers stood stiff as statues around her coffin, their discipline clashing painfully with the memory of her wild, radiant freedom. In Harlem and in Paris, ordinary people wept not for a lieutenant, but for a woman whose heart had loved too fiercely, given too much, burned too bright. Josephine Baker went to her grave wrapped in ceremony, but beneath the medals and military wool rested the same rebel soul that had refused to bow to racism, to poverty, to history itself. The world finally buttoned her up only when it was certain she would never again shock them, seduce them, or demand more from them. The medals remained cold. The applause faded. But the legend of a black diamond, polished, pressured, nearly broken by the weight of recognition, continues to shimmer long after the uniform was lowered into the earth. Darryl Banks. A shattered 45. A face buried under makeup. A legend laid to rest in silence. In a crumbling corner of a Detroit funeral home, the air felt frozen, not just with grief, but with neglect. There were no fresh flowers. No swelling organ. No long line of industry executives pretending to mourn. Beside the casket sat only one thing of value, a cracked 45 revolutions per minute single, the original pressing of "Open the Door to Your Heart." The very record that carried the thunder of his soul-stirring voice now lay split in two, like the life it represented. A harsh yellow light poured down onto his face, thick with makeup, heavy, uneven, almost grotesque. It wasn't art. It was concealment. A desperate attempt to mask the bullet wound that ended his life after a heated confrontation with a plainclothes officer. The cosmetics couldn't hide the violence. If anything, they magnified it. The scene was suffocating, cruel, almost surreal. A record that would one day be worth tens of thousands of dollars sat abandoned beside a body the justice system seemed equally willing to discard. In February 1970, the killing of Darryl Banks didn't just take a man. It pierced the fragile illusion of safety for black men in America. You could be a rising star on vinyl, your voice echoing across radios nationwide. But step outside into the daylight, and you were still a target. Shot in broad daylight by an unmarked officer, his death exposed an era where authority too often meant immunity, where self-defense could mask something far darker. Personal conflict became fatal. Power replaced due process. And suddenly, the life of a brilliant soul singer was valued less than the slug buried deep in his chest. The cracked record beside his coffin felt symbolic, unfinished business. A career cut short just as it was ascending. Media headlines reduced him to a suspect in a so-called dispute, quietly protecting the badge while tarnishing the man. No layer of foundation could erase that injustice. No headline could rewrite the truth. They painted him as trouble. They should have celebrated him as talent. The empty seats said everything. No label executives. No industry power brokers who once praised his voice when it was profitable. Just a handful of grieving relatives in a cold room that smelled faintly of chemicals and loss. Outside, newspapers ran sterile, detached stories about a police-involved shooting, carefully avoiding the words that mattered. Only the people of Detroit, the working-class fans who understood what his music meant, carried real loyalty. To them, that shattered 45 wasn't just vinyl. It was a fragment of the American dream, blown apart. Darryl Banks left this world in the terrifying quiet of unanswered justice. What remained was a funeral heavy with silence, a room thick with the ghost of gunpowder, and a soul music scene forever missing one of its most powerful voices. Ivory Joe Hunter. Black smoke rising over a grave, secret scores reduced to ash, and one final command: burn it all. In 1974, beneath a gray sky and the heavy perfume of funeral lilies, mourners gathered to say goodbye to Ivory Joe Hunter. Prayers drifted softly through the cemetery air until a strange, bitter scent cut through the silence. From behind the coffin, a thin ribbon of gray smoke began to curl upward. Not a raging fire, not chaos, but something far more deliberate. The moment his body was lowered into the earth, hundreds of his original manuscripts, unreleased compositions, handwritten melodies, songs the world had never heard, were fed to the flames. It was his final wish. That smoke carried more than burning paper. It carried fragments of genius. It carried unfinished harmonies. It carried the quiet fury of a man who chose destruction over distortion. Officially, lung cancer took him at 60. But the deeper wound wasn't in his chest, it was in his trust. A perfectionist to the core, Ivory Joe feared not death, but betrayal. He feared producers reshaping his music, opportunists profiting from drafts he deemed unworthy, strangers polishing what he considered incomplete. To him, imperfection in the wrong hands was a fate worse than oblivion. So he chose the fire. The embers hovering over his grave felt like a second burial, this time for the music itself. Mourners wept not only for the man, but for the symphonies that would never breathe. Notes that could have echoed for generations dissolved into smoke, rising briefly before vanishing into a sky that gave nothing back. When the final flame flickered out, all that remained was a haze, dark, defiant, and unforgettable. A symbol of a soul that would rather self-destruct than surrender its purity. The funerals of black legends are often grand, sometimes solemn, but beneath the flowers and speeches, they can also reveal something harsher. How fame consumes, how legacy terrifies, how brilliance sometimes burns itself to stay untainted. If this hidden chapter moved you, leave your thoughts below. And subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue uncovering the haunting, untold stories buried deep within the legacy of black icons in entertainment.